All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the NeoVintage podcast. I am Jabril, and I'm with
Steve.
And if you guys haven't noticed already, this is a new kind of version of our podcast. This is the Final Fantasy VII Spoilercast. We've talked about this a couple weeks now, and we wanted to give you guys a chance to play through the game. We finished the games ourselves, and now we're just going to basically go into depth about our thoughts. Full spoilers, guys. So I don't want nobody saying, hey, you guys told me the ending. If you have not beat the game, do not listen to your podcast. We're going to have a small segment on this podcast where we give our general thoughts on it, and there might not be no spoilers there. But going forward, we're going to talk about everything, front to back, in the remake. This is also going to have spoilers probably for the original game, too. So if you haven't played that and you're worried about potential future remake after spoilers, probably not the podcast for you either. So let's get started on the first major segment where we're going to talk about our general thoughts on the game. So, Steve, what's your general thoughts about the game?
So, in my general thoughts, and this is going in as its own game, what did I get for this $60 purchase? I'm not looking at the whole Final Fantasy universe. So, as its standalone game, it is beyond good. I don't even know how to describe it. It's way better than I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to feel incomplete. I thought it was going to feel janky. I thought it was going to feel super washed out and boring, retreading so many, familiar territory for so many people. Not just me who's played the original Final Fantasy and seen the movies and stuff like that. As a standalone game, I can see someone coming in brand new and enjoying this game to a crazy extent, falling in love with some of the characters. And so my general thoughts is that, the gameplay is super good and it's super kind of addicting. The graphics and the art style, Final Fantasy, especially with the 7 franchise, it's pretty much hit this pinnacle where, with like Advent Children, the games, it's all kind of had that same look and style. So it is interesting to see how they were able to bring it back into a retro style, but still look crisp and clean. The soundtracks are fantastic, as amazing as ever. Missions go from super good to annoying, and every game has, its downfalls where some of the stuff is super dragged out, annoying to do. I'm sure we'll discuss the gym section at some point with the pull-ups and squats and all that stuff, which is it's something. But it's crazy where they were able to take something that's so familiar, so treaded on at this point. Final Fantasy VII, the original, is found everywhere. You can get it on your iPhone, Switch. It's always ported over. It's all over PC. So it's incredible where they were able to take something so familiar, so iconic, and still bring so much freshness to it and really able to give it so much more life that so many people kind of dreaded on already. And obviously changing the gameplay is a big factor in that. Changing some of the, side stories and minor, long-going story segments have been changed and been able to just really bring such a beloved icon from 1997 to 2020, and it feels so good to play. Feels so familiar and brand new at the same time when you're walking around Midgar. So when I look at what do I generally feel about this game, is that it's really a icon now, where it's it's not, I wouldn't say it's like a masterpiece, but it's definitely building to a bigger saga that's going to be really amazing to experience for the first time, and for a recap, and after so long after playing the originals. So it's great to be able to sit back and have it. So it's such a good experience. I take it back. It's a great experience. That game, I spent so much time with it that I enjoyed so much of it. And there's only, again, a few hour segments that I really started disliking it. And games nowadays, especially the way this one's format, usually gets super stale really quick. And I'm glad they weren't suffering from that in many aspects. So what are some of your general thoughts on it?
Yeah, so I share a lot of the thoughts with you. I'm really, really high on this game. I really, really love it. It's one of my favorite games of the year. I say it's a great game. I wouldn't say that it's perfect. It does have its issues. I definitely feel like there were certain gimmicky aspects of the original game that I think they kind of moved forward with in this one, and not, straight ports, but for example, like the arm mechanic, moving the arm through the collapsed passageway, is an example of just kind of fluff that they added that I found more to be an annoyance than anything. Or like when you're syncing up trying to do the switches, At the same time, it's small stuff like that I found to just be more annoyances than anything, and I don't think really added anything to the overall experience. So I took issue with some of those things, and it seemed like weird gameplay mechanic changes that are reminiscent of stuff that they did on the PS1 era that I didn't feel like they need to bring going forward. Not to mention how many crazy major changes they made with this title. I was surprised that some of the stuff that they chose to bring forward, like the squatting minigame, again, not something that I necessarily have a problem with in its entirety, but I was just surprised with some of the choices of what they chose to bring over. But I understand that you have to do some kind of like head nods and acknowledgement of the original title, and so I'll give them the benefit of the doubt on that one. But yeah, generally speaking, I love this game. I think it's phenomenal. I'm already kind of thinking about replaying it a little bit because I kind of have a thirst for more. In terms of kind of like getting your money's worth out of it, I definitely think, the 25 to 30, for some people 35, 40 hour experience, I think is more than worth it. I do think that if you've played the original game, you could definitely see the areas that they chose to stretch out, especially once you get the little side quest sections that, again, are very much sectioned off. There are two major moments in the game where they're kind of like dumping side quests on you, and depending on how you approach it, you could do them all then, you could span them out a little bit. But for the most part, the approach of not necessarily sprinkling side quests in throughout the game, but instead doing massive dumps on you where you can kind of just do that section, I think in some ways works to its disservice. Instead of kind of having you on this kind of nice forward momentum experience, I feel like at times it kind of trips up, and it either gives you a reason to skip them entirely or do nothing but side quests for 5 hours. And I didn't mind that, but if the side quest material didn't necessarily resonate with you, I could see someone taking pretty major issue with those sections. And I've talked to some other people who have had thoughts on it, and they all kind of universally have had the same thought, where it's like the story and the engine and the gameplay are all incredible, but they feel like there's just a bit of fluff in there, and needless fluff, or filler, if you will. And I don't necessarily disagree with them. The filler at no point made it to the point where I didn't want to play the game anymore, or do I feel like it subtracted from the overall score too much. But I think there's work to be done there, and I understand that they wanted to hyper focus on a specific subsection of the story, Midgar, and span that over 25 to 30 hours. But I think there was possibly a better way to do that, and if I was them, maybe I would have had the same amount of side quests, but made one of them focus on Jesse, for example, or one of them be a side quest for Wedge, and use the opportunity to expand upon older characters and integrate that into the side quest in a more effective manner, rather than gathering ingredients for somebody to make a potion. You know what I mean? Like, so there's pros and cons in that regard, but generally speaking, I think this is a phenomenal game. They by far exceeded my expectations. I'm gonna be straight up honest. I like you, I wasn't too keen on the idea of this happening originally, because I didn't think they would honestly be able to deliver it at the quality that they did, and honestly, they proved me wrong. I was incorrect. They managed to do it. They managed to do it at an incredibly high level, and it makes me super excited for what the future holds.
Yeah, for sure. It's such a good base, and it's such a good feeling thinking, well, it can only get better. Especially for you and I who know where the story gets, and still being a little spoiler free. If you really like where the story is now,
oh yeah,
and you enjoy the characters that are in the game right now,
forget about it.
Forget about it. You are gonna just go completely just overwhelmed with how much happens and how much is revealed. And I can only imagine what they're gonna do to really impact that stuff, where they're gonna put even more backstory for certain things. I think it's just gonna get to a point where I think like people will look at this, whatever ends up being trilogy or whatever, how many parts it is, people are going to be looking at it and be like, this is fantastic. This is some great work.
Yeah, because I would say from an aesthetic standpoint and a world standpoint, Midgar is probably the most resonant area in the game. It's the most, thematically consistent with all the machinery and Shinra's operation being there and stuff like that. And from like almost like a flashy perspective, I think that. But once you leave Midgar, in terms of a lore perspective, it's not even comparable. Like the world building they do, and when you see the full array of what that world has to offer, you realize that Midgar is but a cog in a massive wheel of insane, weird places with all different types of themes. There's mountains, there's deserts, there's Aztec-looking towns. Like, there's all different types of places that will invoke different styles of imagery, and especially once you go to places like Nibelheim, it will be so thematically different than what you experienced in Midgard that it'll almost feel like, with exception for seeing the same characters, an entirely different game. So I'm really excited to see, where they expand from there, because again, if you liked part 1, if they keep up this level of quality, I could only imagine how much people are going to love part 2 and 3 once you really find out what's going on in this world from an enemy's perspective, what you're really dealing with, all the literally centuries and millennia worth of lore that are present in this world. So I guess we can move on to the second major segment of this spoiler cast, which is the thoughts on the major departures and differences from the original game to the remake. Now, they made a lot of interesting choices here. Now, generally speaking, it's the same story. But I think the most major departure from the remake to this version is, and again, this is your warning, guys, this is where the major spoilers begin. The remake ends kind of with a spliced version of the ending of the original game, with Sephiroth going into angel mode and you guys going into this weird celestial plane and fighting him there. That's pretty much the final fight sequence of the original game total, with exception for the injection of Genova into there.
Yes.
So seeing them put that in remake, I understand why they did that, because I guess if you really do honestly take the original game and cut it off when they leave Midgar, there's no real final boss there, to be honest. You have the highway sequence, and then after that, that's pretty much it. And so I guess they found the need to give a final boss some weight, which was Sephiroth, so they kind of took the Sephiroth fight from the end and put it into the end of Remake 1, which is an interesting choice. It makes me curious as to how they're going to end this whole saga now that they've already kind of done that fight. Maybe they'll just hyper-focus on Genova at that point. What did you think about that specific choice, about them taking the Sephiroth fight and injecting it to the end and having a whole new section once they leave that highway sequence?
Yeah, so this is where I always struggled when we knew that this was focused on Midgar. I was always like, man, so you're going to end the game with the Rufus fight, which is very anticlimactic in a sense. It's an interesting fight because the game really focuses, Final Fantasy VII Remake brings those one-on-one fights that people love from like Kingdom Hearts and amplifies it when you're going against, the two Turks and like Reno and Rude. I think. Yeah. Those fights are really good. So I was like, well, man, maybe they can get creative. When I was like halfway through the game and I was like, they have not mentioned Rufus at all. Oh, I think they mentioned him, but he was not integrated again. I was like, they can't just get you to that point and then you fight Rufus and the game's over. I'm like, that's going to be weird. Because I kept thinking in my brain, I'm like, well, Rufus is pretty much the cutoff when that Midgar section's over. Yeah, because then there's a bike section after. So I was like,
yeah, you're trying to escape Midgar and they send the machine after you.
Yeah, so I was like, are they going to end the game there? And the way they had Sephiroth kind of peppered in throughout the story made sense. It made sense to me, who knew what was going on, who knew why Cloud was like freaking out every time something would remind him and of another character we'll get to in a second. It was interesting to see where, when the game went full on just Cloud Sephiroth, and I was like, yo, is this the ending to the whole game? And I'm like, oh, what are they gonna save though for that section? So as soon as Sephiroth, as his theme song hit and he released his one wing, I was like, this is incredible. It was great to see it in there, but I was like, people are gonna be lost. Where are we? And what's going on? Why does Sephiroth have this one wing? What's going on? Why is Cloud and Sephiroth so connected? What's going on? And there's so much backstory there. So it was shocking to me, and I think I was shocked and like watching the screen the whole time because I had no idea where they were going. Because I was like, well, the game doesn't end here. There's still so much, but this is the ending. And that's when you start getting into a little bit of the more, where are they, Sephiroth knowing that they're gonna confront later with I give you 7 seconds and that whole speech. But when I think of that ending and where they decided to cut this game off, it was just all shocking and at the same time expected. Because one thing Final Fantasy VII always relies on is the Cloud Sephiroth dynamic. And they just they can't resist themselves when they do anything Final Fantasy VII. Sephiroth's in there. When they did the Advent Children movie, of course, Sephiroth's in there. When they did, the Crisis Core game, who's the main character, Sephiroth. Yeah. And when they added in Kingdom Hearts, when they started adding Cloud and other characters, surprise, surprise, who's around the corner? Sephiroth. So that's a thing. So I knew they'd incorporate him somehow, and we obviously saw from trailers that Sephiroth was integrated way earlier through some means. So it was shocking, and then at the same time not surprising that's where they decided to end this game, is because obviously the Sephiroth story really starts to ramp up in the later segments, and that game ends with them all being like, well, we took care of one issue, but what's with Sephiroth? What's he doing? What's going on? Cloud obviously is not giving him all the information that he has, because he himself is a little confused. So it was, I think, the right way to tie it up. At the same time, makes me wonder how they're going to change the final ending and surprise us that way, because they can't just copy and paste it and put you in that space again.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point where them injecting some stuff that's going to confuse people who are not super familiar with the entirety of the Final Fantasy story. And that brings me to one specific point where they have Tifa, and it's framed as kind of like the flashback where she's in her cowboy outfit, and that's obviously a reference to when they were in Nibelheim, where quote unquote Cloud and Sephiroth go to the town to check out the reactor, and that is also the place where Zack is killed. Correct. And you have Tifa kind of grabbing the sword, trying to exert her vengeance, and she's hurt there pretty bad. So that's a reference back to that story. But again, if you don't know the context behind that, that's an interesting scene to kind of splice in there, kind of needlessly. Yes. But I think that's an interesting choice. And I also would like to make a note that it's kind of interesting that this is actually not a remake of Final Fantasy VII, the PS1 game. This is actually taking the entire Final Fantasy VII compilation, which is the official name for all the Final Fantasy VII media. That's Final Fantasy VII, that's Crisis Core, Dirge of Cerberus, the PS2 game, Advent Children, and the anime movie, and the MMO RPG before Crisis, putting that all together into the Final Fantasy VII compilation. This game is almost in many ways a remake of that, because the integration of Zack narratively this early in the way they did at the end of Remake 1 tells me that they're going to go more into Cloud's soldier days in relation with co-opting Zack's story and working under Sephiroth way deeper than the original one was. And if they're going to narratively splice that one in, then that means they're going into Crisis Core territory, which makes me wonder, once they introduce characters like Vincent Valentine, are they going to inject some stuff, like maybe flash forwards into Dirge of Cerberus stuff? You know what I mean?
Because that's a great way to put it, is that they're retelling the whole compilation, which is the universe, it's the MCU, quote-unquote, of Final Fantasy VII.
Yes, and they're taking away the detached nature of the Final Fantasy VII story and trying to make it one all-in-one kind of narrative.
Exactly, because the big one that caught me off guard is when, I think it's like 2 or 3 times where you see the Tifa in the cowboy outfit. And I had a friend who's played Final Fantasy VII. He's like, is that a future flash of it? Like, is somehow Cloud seeing the future? And I'm like, no. And I had to remind him, like, that's Cloud. That's Crisis Core. That's what Tifa looks like in Crisis Core, is her cowboy outfit, and that's all the Zack stuff that's going on.
Yeah, and all the flashbacks in the original one too, when they go to the Nibelheim scene, explaining Cloud's soldier background 5 years ago when they supposedly saw each other. That's lightly tackled in the original one too.
Yeah, you're true that as well. But yeah, of course. So that is surprising, where they're just. It's interesting that they're trying to retell that, and then that does make me start thinking the differences that are going to start happening. And obviously, the main difference was that ending scene that we talked about already. The only other main differences story-wise is the things they've added, which was honestly was more just a little bit of the Avalanche crew. In the original, unless my memory is wrong, the 3 Avalanche crew, Wedge, Biggs, and Jesse, they all do perish, correct?
During the plate collapse, all 3 of them died.
During the plate collapse. Which I never really cared about, because in the original Final Fantasy VII, they don't do anything with that.
They were not significant characters.
No.
Other than that intro mission and a couple moments in Seventh Heaven, no.
Yeah. Obviously, in this game, you have a whole segment about Jesse's background, which is, for most people I talk to, is a mixed review. It's weird. It's good to see how these guys why they do what they do. They do have family. Wedge is a cat person, which is not, I don't think I ever even mentioned in the original 7. No. But he's, he loves his cats and stuff like that. And, they're freedom warriors for a reason. And it's such a weird interjection. Not one I would have expected for them to sit on and talk about the Avalanche crew so much. But I found myself caring. Where I was like, oh, that's so much stuff. And then I started getting worried, because I was like, well, I know their fates. And so when it played out the way it did, with actually only, Jesse's the only one who's, as of right now, dead, right? In the remake? Because they show Biggs.
You could say definitively that Jesse's dead. However, we also saw Biggs die, and he woke up in a bed at the end of the remake. So that tells me, I guess until you see a formal body on Jesse, there's nothing necessarily keeping her from coming back in some capacity too.
Yeah, I'm under the impression she's coming back, because people got, she got fans in this one. People love her.
You're talking to one.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Me too. Obviously.
I love Jessie, and I love what they've done with her as a character.
She was so good. So these are all backstories that they changed from the original, because we never saw or really heard much about them. And seeing their connections on why they fight so much. When you find out, like, Jesse's dad is sick because he was working for Shinra and all that stuff. And even though that mission didn't really play out the way I thought it would, it showed that they were more than just throwaway characters. And they're full-fledged characters with stories, with lives, and it's so different when you get to see them. So when you see them, to this point, thinking they're perishing in the collapse of the plate, it hurt a little bit. I was like, oh man, that sucks, because they were so good. I actually kind of cared for them. They're not just a polygon that I played for the first 5 hours and I never see them again.
Yeah, and one thing was, I loved their depictions of the new, Avalanche, or old Avalanche members, but new iterations of them. I loved it so much. And so that's what kind of disappointed me the most, is I felt like they could have just did more with it. And there's always the argument that's like, well, there's more remakes coming, and they're still alive. At least Wedge and Biggs are. So, like, the light storytelling with Biggs and, his work with that small community with the children in that orphanage, that story can, or I believe it was an orphanage, or at least some kind of school. That can continue. Wedge, they can keep going. The problem with Jessie is, it was a character I loved. You met her family and stuff like that. So in many ways, she got more exposition than the rest of them. But the problem is, once you factor in, like, her acting background and her relationship with Cloud that was lightly developing, that's kind of dead now, unfortunately. And I guess maybe in many ways you can make the artistic argument that it's like, well, that kind of anticlimactic nature of her death is why it's so painful, because so much was on the horizon. There's so much what ifs. Could there have been something developing there? We don't know. And I'm talking more so than just the kind of the surface romantic level between her and Cloud. I'm just talking about that relationship in general, learning her as a character, what motivates her, what makes her tick. I felt like there was more to explore there. And I feel like in many ways they really did a lot of great work in exposition in terms of fleshing her out as a character. And I just am kind of saddened with the fact that in many ways, until we see something to convince us otherwise, that is the end of it. That's the end of her story. That's the end of her saga. In many ways, they might introduce her story through maybe her parents making a reappearance in some capacity, but for the most part, that's the end of her story. I also wanted to make a note where you mentioned earlier not knowing exactly where this game was going to end, considering the fact of how Remake 1 ends in relation to the original. Yes. I would like to make the note that with them obviously working in some ideas from Crisis Core, the ending of Final Fantasy VII Remake as a saga may not necessarily be the end of Final Fantasy VII from 1997. The end of Final Fantasy VII Remake could be the end of Advent Children, with Sephiroth being attempt to be reanimated. So
Yeah, that's true.
I would say the whole classic final battle, and we're like, oh, they already used that. What are they going to do? Well, I would like to say maybe that's not the end of the narrative. Maybe when we're on remake 4 or 5 or whatever it ends up going to, everybody's like, oh my god, they just beat Genova. This is where the final fight between you and Sephiroth happens, and that fight, plays out as it is, and then they see that there's another, 5 hours of the game left. That could be a mind-blowing experience for people, where there's like, oh my god, the franchise, the one piece of Final Fantasy media that we all love almost as much, if not more than 7, is Advent Children, especially our generation.
Yeah, for sure, because we saw those characters come alive, and that would be an interesting shock where I would almost drop my controllers. Like if I beat Final Fantasy 7 story-wise, and then they would do the time skip. Obviously, there's a 2-year gap between 7 and Advent Children, if I'm not wrong. And then to play that section,
there's
after seeing what Cloud did and everything that happened, and then to see these characters 2 years later dealing with the fallout, dealing with, and we've gone into spoiler territory, dealing with Aerith's death. And what that leads into would be fantastic. I did not even think about that. And that gets me so excited. I have a grin on my face because if I can play Advent Children section, forget about it. I'm in love.
Yeah, and obviously we're just kind of, playing around with ideas. By no means am I saying that that's likely or unlikely to happen. I'm not working at Square. I'm not saying. I'm just saying with them being willing to kind of span outside of the traditional game and incorporate elements from, outside pieces of media, I don't think it's necessarily unlikely that they take, at the very least, storylines from Advent Children and tack that on at the end, or if anything, do flash forwards in some capacity and incorporate it that way. Because and we can get, back into spoiler territory, the ending of Final Fantasy VII Remake, they have that scene of, not Red 13, but his ancestors, or predecessors, I guess the term would be, his predecessors, running through the field showing the overgrowth on Midgar, which is the post-credit scene of the original game.
Correct.
And it's peculiar that they injected that here, which tells me that if they put that here, the traditional ending structure of the game is not necessarily something they're adhering to in the same way. So that tells me that it's at least a possibility that they go beyond where the original Final Fantasy VII ends. If they've already taken that ending and spliced it in, different places in the remake part 1, by the time they get to 5, I wouldn't be surprised, or 3 to 5 or whatever, how many parts this ends up being, I wouldn't be surprised if they are willing to expand narratively years beyond where the original game ended and get into that Advent Children storylines and get into, maybe they do follow-ups on characters like Leslie that they've given more weight to. There's so many different places that they can explore that they have more than enough time to do now that they have the tech. There's no technical limitations. They're not dealing within the confines of a single game. They're dealing with multiple games all tying into one single narrative. So I think kind of like the possibilities are endless.
Yeah, it's exciting to think that, because like you said, they are incorporating so much. There is a little bit more Crisis, like we've mentioned already, there's a little bit more Crisis Core incorporated into this one than you remember. Because the only flashback I remember that was kind of similar was, I think, when you're at the playground with Aerith, and she's like, oh, your eyes remind me of someone. And she goes to say Zack Fair's name. Cloud doesn't want to hear it. He has his little episode. That I remember from the original to an extent. But, even that ending of Crisis Core that you see at the end of the remake part 1, where he's like bringing Cloud over, that is edited a little bit because, like we've said, Zack gets rocked. He gets killed. And that leads on to Cloud becoming who Cloud is. So they aren't afraid to change certain aspects. And that doesn't mean that Zack's alive. That does mean things are going to change. That does mean things are going to be reworked. And I do really assume that, at least in the next part or two, again, depending on what the aspect, we are going to get way more Crisis Core flashbacks. You're going to play, I'm almost guaranteed you're going to play as Zack at one point. There's going to be at least a chapter or so that you'll play as Zack that helps fill out that aspect. So it's interesting because now they do have so much to pull from and so much lore that filling out the rest of the game to a new extent and be so much newer to fan bases is going to be incredible.
Yeah, not to mention, I mean, as they I would imagine it's probably going to fall into the next part. They've gone into a lot of people's backstory. Clouds they're probably not going to go into for quite a while, obviously, because that kind of breaks the story wide open, and you don't really find out what's going on until way later through dream sequences with Tifa and Cloud, like way later in the game. That would probably be the last part, if anything. So with the next part, I would imagine you're going to get more into Aerith's past. Because obviously, she does pass away. And so that's something they're going to explore. And that's kind of like the halfway point of the game, I would say. She dies. So, or halfway to 75%, somewhere around there. She dies through the game. So with going into her past, that's where they would obviously inject a lot of the newer characters. They would expand into Zack at that point. And understand, you would get more of context of what the soldier program was really looking at, and to explore Zack, obviously that's where you need to go more into the Crisis Core material. Not to mention you have characters like Ifalna and her father and stuff like that, which is her mother and father, that they can go in that direction too. And there's a lot of lore that's rather quickly addressed in the original one through Cloud watching tapes that I feel like they can do a whole different approach in this one. So part 2 can be almost solely dedicated to Aerith and her kind of circle around her and have a full featured game in many ways. So I'm really excited to see how that plays out.
Yeah, that's going to be incredible to really see them redo that in obviously a little bit more modern way.
Yeah, so the last major section we can cover before wrapping this up is the thoughts on the release strategy and the future of this franchise. And we've already kind of scratched at this idea, but they went episodic, obviously. And in many ways, I feel like calling this an episodic game is a little of a misnomer, because it's not episodic in a telltale way. It's more episodic in we expanded this game so much that it's a literal impossibility to do this in a single game. I mean, honestly, at the pace they're going, this whole experience is going to be well over probably 170 to 200 hours at this pace. Yeah. If they got 30 hours out of Midgar, I could only imagine once you factor in Golden Saucer and all these different places, like we're talking about hundreds of hours at this point. So episodic is a bit of a misnomer, a bit kind of underplaying the significance of what they're doing, and it was something I criticized a lot when they announced it. When they announced they were gonna break this into parts, I was not too hot on that idea. And I was like, really? Like your most iconic Final Fantasy game, you're going to break this up into chunks and make people pay $60 each? How criminal is that? But now playing this game, I understand. If you guys are going to do this and calling this a remake is kind of underplaying what they're doing. This is a reimagining of Final Fantasy VII. It makes all the sense in the world why they went this choice. But obviously at this pace, it makes me confused as to how they're ever going to pull this off in under 10 years, you know what I mean? Just the sheer amount of information and lore and story and characters that they have yet to even go through. They have a vast majority of the game that they have yet to address. And judging by the turnaround time of the first part, even if you cut that dev cycle in half, we're talking about, at the low end, 6 to 7 years, at the high end, 10 years to do this whole game. And again, I might have my numbers all the way wrong, and they might prove me wrong again and find a way to get this out way faster. But as of right now, the pace and the level of quality they're doing this at, I don't see how they do this in a shorter time period than that. What do you think?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So when people always ask me, like, when do you think the next part will release? And I'm like, at earliest, depending on what the team looks like. Square Enix is pretty big. What the team looks like, what the cycle looks like. Because you got to remember, we're amid, COVID-19 throwing things off and people having to work from home. There's only so much of this stuff you can work from home, and the voice acting, translations, and all this kind of stuff. Depending on how fast they want to do it, and I know they've just had interviews about they want to do faster, smaller parts. You start reaching into dangerous territory when you do that, because you can't just keep pumping out smaller parts and still charge $60 every time. Again, I don't know what that plan looks like when you start adding in next gen, because when the next part comes out, we're gonna be on the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series, and we'll be in that generation. So you're gonna start dividing people to an aspect, and backwards compatibility works for some, but when it goes to the point where part 3 comes, what does that part 3 look like? Because part 2, I still assume part 2 will be released on PS4 and PS5. When part 3 comes, Are you gonna strand it on a PS5 and the new generation? Are you gonna be able to make it work on the old generation? So that's where the really schedule land. Like if we were at the beginning of a cycle, I'd be like a little bit more understanding of what that looks like, because you're gonna start start breaking things into segments, and then your fan base there's gonna be people who just for no reason will buy a PS5, just they won't do it. And they have part 1 and part 2 on PS4, let's say, and for some reason now they can't continue your story on PS5. That's when I start looking at this episodic thing as an issue. And I don't like calling it episodic. I like calling it, I guess, like segments and parts and stuff like that, because
it's closer to 13, 13.2, 13.3 more so than an episodic game.
Yeah, and I assume that's what they're going to go with name-wise. It's going to be called Final Fantasy 7-2. Well, Final Fantasy 7 Remake -2. For some reason, because the fact that they didn't call this just like Final Fantasy 7 Midgar and then call the next thing some other segment, they're not dumb. They didn't call it Episode 1 because then you get into, like you said, Telltale territory, and it just looks weird and it looks wrong. And then those have always been like small bite-sized chapters that are like $15. This is a full $60, $80 if you got the deluxe edition. So when we're looking at time-wise, I guess I would probably expect the next part would be at the earliest fall 2022, which is super hopeful and super like optimistic, because I don't think after that you can get away with releasing a PS4 game at the same time as releasing a PS5 game, and that gets muddied until we start seeing games roll out and we see what that looks like. We won't really see, because I'm assuming Square Enix will follow the trend that everyone's doing at that point. Segment wise, like we were saying, episodic wise, I just don't see where they can start fitting in parts and rewriting things that we've been discussing before they get too bloated and too big. I don't want 7 parts of Final Fantasy 7. And if you start incorporating all this other stuff and the stuff they're going to start rewriting and adding in, and other segments and chapters that start stretching the game out, like chapter 14, I believe. Yeah, chapter 14, before you scale, that whole segment, that whole chapter is filler.
Yeah.
It's mission, it's go do this. For some reason, they let you unlock fast travel there when you don't need it anymore, which...
Oh, the Chocobo thing? Yeah.
There's this Chocobo mission that gives you fast travel, even though from 15 on to the end, you're not in an open world section. So it was weird. They gave you fast travel for just that section.
I could have used that way earlier in the game.
Yeah, it made no sense. Again, it's those kind of hiccups and things that I think they're gonna fix. And like we've discussed on, I think, a couple episodes, or I think it was actually when Final Fantasy 7 had just released, where the game's it is streamlined to an extent. Like if you took out some of the fluff, this game would have been a shorter game. I feel like it would have been a little bit tighter game. But then you start getting
20 hours probably.
Yeah, but then you start getting into this area, like you're gonna charge me $60 every so often for this segment, for this, and that's why it plays where I think this format was gonna work, whether it's like a semi-open world and it's an action RPG for almost the whole part. I think that just won't carry on for too long. I think you're gonna start them experimenting with a little bit more. I think the summons can be worked a little bit different, and I think that's what we're gonna start seeing. Is that they're gonna test little bits out, but they at the same time, while they're doing that, they know they need to cap this off. That they can't stretch this for so long, because extending outside of Final Fantasy 7, Final Fantasy 16 is a thing. Someone's Square Enix has to be working on it to an extent.
Some stage of development that has to be happening.
Yeah, and on top of that, Square Enix does have I know they have a core team that works like on Final Fantasy. You have them for some reason trying to crank out more Kingdom Hearts games.
Yeah.
Amongst they have they work with other teams, aren't they? Doing they're the ones working on Avengers, right? Them and Crystal Dynamics.
Yeah, I believe Square is like a publisher on that, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, yeah, but they have their hands full. And Final Fantasy 7, for so long they didn't do this remake because they were like, we don't know really how to do it just. They were like, we don't know how to do it the right way. It is such a big game to do, and you can't just make the graphics pretty and then put it out, because that wouldn't have worked. If this came out beat for beat, via like the Resident Evil remakes, it just wouldn't have worked.
No,
because
it wouldn't have translated well into the modern gamer.
Because of the story, the way the characters react, that stuff had to be reworked. Whereas Resident Evil, you're really by yourself the whole time, besides a few interactions. that's where it's weird when I start thinking of the future of where these parts go. It's very confusing. For me, it won't be the worst because for all intents and purposes, I'm going to have a PS5. My PS4 will always be here, so if I need to some reason go backwards, it'll be there. But you got to think of the majority of people may not be able to do that. They may, some people will not be able to jump to the new generation. So that's my concern of the future of the series. I'm not concerned about time-wise. I do think there will be probably some weird time. I feel like the next part will probably come out slower, and then after that, the parts will kind of crank a little bit faster. But it's just confusing, and it's hard to guess what the future of the release schedule looks like.
Yeah, and I mean, you're a little bit more optimistic with their likelihood to drop on a PS4 with the next iteration than I am, just because timetable-wise, if we're talking about 2022, a PS4 game dropping, and I know there's overlap between generations, of course. Those PS3 games, like Persona 5, came out on PS3 when the PS4 had been out. So that's not an abnormal thing to happen necessarily, but when you're talking about years into a generation, I mean, if what is not even rumored, but what is confirmed to happen right now with next gen actually plays out the way it is, and dev cycles are slowed on top of that because of this pandemic, that means games, I would imagine, be pushed off a little bit. So yeah, if you're into 2022 territory and you're talking about dropping a PS4 game, even with a current gen iteration of it, I don't know if they're going to be doing that, which means that you don't want to have part one of a quote unquote episodic or part game and then episode 2 be on cross-gen. Not to mention, adoption rates are a little slow. So it takes time for everybody to adopt the new consoles and make that jump. So that means essentially for at least some time, you're going to be cutting your player base down a little bit with this next part. So it's like a weird situation they're in where it's like you want to release it on the PS4 because that's where most of the people are, the biggest player base. However, when you're well into a new console cycle, people are trying to play on their new pieces of hardware. So you want to play to them too, and it's like, how long do you pander to an old model? Not to mention, there's an argument to be made for technical innovation. And if you need to make a game that plays to the lowest common denominator, which is going to be PS4 players, the PS5 iteration can only be so ambitious. And so they're in a tricky situation. They launched at a weird time. It's unfortunate for them that they weren't able to get this out and maybe back in 2015, for example, or something like that, where they could have had some more years to put out multiple parts so they could have got more of this story on one generation of hardware instead of being in this weird transitionary point. But I understand, in terms of timetable things play out the way they play out. Ultimately, I feel like Final Fantasy Remake 2 can be a system seller because sequels sell well, especially when they're as well beloved as Final Fantasy 7 coming off of a remake that's so well beloved like the first one. This could be used as a system seller if they play their cards right and make sure the marketing's correct on it. And maybe they can make more people adopt PS5s if it remains an exclusive all the way through, which I'm assuming it will be, or at least some degree of a timed exclusive. So, I mean, the future is very ambiguous with the release schedule of this because many of it is kind of tied into what kind of game they're playing with the next generation consoles. And how, Square Enix, not to mention, their whole timetable could be delayed right now because obviously this pandemic hit, but they were already in the late stages of development for this game. So it was probably affected by COVID-19, but it wasn't it's not make or break with COVID-19 in terms of this game. It was for the most part done by that point. So they were able to get it out now. For part 2, that's in a whole different ball game. And I don't know what stage of development they're in right now. They're obviously not in post-production or anything like that. But I would imagine this pandemic is probably affecting the output for sure. And so that's going to have a cascading effect. The longer it takes them to make 2, the longer it's going to take, or the later they start 3, which is the later they start part 4 or 5 or whatever. So this current period we're in right now is going to have cascading effects for the rest of the release schedule that I could imagine that whatever their original plans to drop this was, it wouldn't be necessarily impossible for them to add another 6 months on top of that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Because you're true on that. Because it is gonna just throw things off. And one thing you pointed out, and I completely kind of spaced out about, was it being a system seller. Because you do have to. Do you think the exclusivity will continue with Sony in this? Because now it's exclusive 1 year on PlayStation 4. So this time next year, when we're all on new systems, it does then come back to Xbox One, which I know is going to be backwards compatible. So you'll be able to play this on your Xbox Series X, I'm sure with some sort of update. And we don't know about Sony on that side. Do you think that continues? So when Part 2 launches, is it exclusive to, let's say, PS5 for a year?
I would say right now I have no reason to believe that at least the timed exclusivity will not carry on for every iteration of this game. We all know that Microsoft has its issues with their Japanese relations in general. And that's something that they're working on. I would imagine they're going to try to give more of concerted effort this next generation coming in. But kind of when you're talking about Japanese devs and the Japanese game industry, Square Enix is kind of the granddaddy of them all. And I feel like Microsoft has a lot of work before they're able to poach a big exclusive from a major Japanese developer like Square Enix. So as of right now, unless they're... And not to mention, again, there's a lot of heritage there going, ironically, back to Final Fantasy VII, the original.
Yeah, that's where it started.
Yeah, there's a long heritage between PlayStation and Square Enix when they jumped ship from Nintendo. So there's a good relationship there. And I don't see them in any way compromising that or not doubling down on that for Xbox. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's true.
I just don't see them putting themselves in a weird position with Sony on behalf of a new console from a publisher that I love very much. But, I mean, it's widely known that they just don't play well in the Japanese market. And so I don't think there's any reason to break exclusivity. Not to mention, like, I don't think Final Fantasy VII Remake sells, like, incredibly well on the Xbox anyways. Again, that fan base is just not there in the same way. There's not as many it sells abysmally in Japan. And a lot of people, if you want RPGs, especially action RPGs, you probably already got a PlayStation, to be honest, by now.
True.
So I just don't think it's in their financial or their relationship-wise best interest to break that timed exclusivity. Now, in pure exclusives, I don't see them moving into that. I think this worked out perfectly fine for them. The year is going to work out just fine. The people on PlayStation are going to be on PlayStation, and that's going to continue into the future. And once you establish your name as a franchise on a single platform, it's kind of known for that going forward. You know what I mean? Like, to many people, when you think of Call of Duty, for many people, it's Xbox. And that goes back, 10 years now? And to that, in no way, Call of Duty is not an Xbox exclusive. If anything, Sony's getting more stuff right now. Yet, that heritage is set up there. That people, they played World at War back on Xbox back in the day, so when World War II comes out and Modern Warfare, oh yeah, I'm getting on Xbox because that's where all my friends are and that's where I've always played Call of Duty, obviously. So fast forward to now, like, there's that built-in install base with Sony. People just associate Final Fantasy with Sony now, especially Final Fantasy VII, which, I mean, is the granddaddy PlayStation 1 exclusive. I think they just continue the strategy as is, and there's no reason to believe that they're going to divert from that. Now, I'm not saying it's an impossibility, but Microsoft hasn't communicated anything in the way that their strategy with Japanese devs is going to switch and that much between the Xbox One generation and the Series X generation.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes complete sense.
And again, I would like to see more people be able to play games all at the same time as much as possible. Not that I have a problem with exclusives, but I like people to be able to play what they want, wherever they want, you know what I mean? Whenever they want. But yeah, just from a financial bottom line, there's just no reason to believe that they pivot from that. And I mean, kind of on a side note, I just hope that Xbox can foster some Japanese relationships a little better with this generation, so games like Final Fantasy VII Remake can have that big, presence on Xbox day one.
Yeah, and I mean, sales numbers too. I just remember it sold incredibly well on PlayStation 4, even amidst the whole physicals may not be coming in at time and stuff like that. It sold incredibly well. So yeah, they might not be like, well, why should we? Because when the Xbox version does come out in a year, I don't think it's going to sell more than it did on PlayStation. So yeah, that all signs will probably point them and be like, well, why would we? Square did take a chance on an exclusivity with Xbox. Again, publishing-wise, with Tomb Raider years ago.
Yeah. And Blue Dragon, you remember that too?
And Blue Dragon, and it did not work in their favor.
No.
So that all that history there will probably keep them in mind, being like, no, we're gonna keep working with our Sony, and Sony probably has some backing and stuff like that and money involved. Which
not to mention, there's a major Square Enix game that kind of recently, within the last few months, came to Xbox One that nobody really talks about on Xbox One because it does not have that support there, and it's Kingdom Hearts 3. That's on Game Pass now.
That's true, and So when I looked at the numbers, I was always curious. So when I looked at numbers, Kingdom Hearts sold obviously more on PlayStation, but it also still, leading up to Kingdom Hearts 3, if you wanted to play all the Kingdom Hearts game, it was PS4 or not. Or, if you had your old consoles, obviously. But if you wanted to play all the collections, all that stuff came to, Game Pass a few months ago. But by then, people were already done. Like, we already played this. You wanted to be there day one. And even though Kingdom Hearts 3 was day one on Xbox One, that sold on PS4 like crazy. That's where people wanted it. That's where people got it. The whole Xbox One X more powerful thing didn't matter because they wanted all of the games they played on PS4, obviously, or on their original consoles. If you wanted to play 3, why would you then jump ship all over there? And, Xbox didn't get the complete collection, like you said, until I think 3 came out in Game Pass.
Yeah, so, to summarize it, for anyone who had any doubts about, like, the potential exclusivity deal that Sony had with Square for Final Fantasy VII Remake, I don't see that changing anytime soon. So, unfortunately, if you don't have a PlayStation and you were hoping that maybe this was only the first part kind of situation, I wouldn't bet on it. I would say get your hands on a PS4 sometime soon because I'm anticipating most, if not all, the parts to follow the exact same trajectory this one did.
Yeah.
All right, so that was the Spoilercast, our first Spoilercast. I would imagine we're going to probably do these for more games as they come out. We're probably going to have one for Cyberpunk, probably have one for Last of Us as that come out, probably Ghost of Tsushima, Halo Infinite when that comes out, Assassin's Creed. We're going to do this for all the major games that we spend a significant time with and have a lot to say about. Time-wise, then Last of Us will probably be the next one. Yeah, most likely, and that's going to be in June. We're going to take a couple weeks to play it, and then you'll probably see the Spoilercast in early July. So it's going to be a good 2 months before you guys see another Spoilercast, but I hope you guys enjoyed our talk about Final Fantasy VII. Again, if you have not played this game, we could not recommend it enough. It's a phenomenal experience and well worth the money.
Yeah, definitely go get it. Definitely, if you're worried about it not feeling complete, it does feel complete. The minor gripes with the game, which would be, some of the side missions and kind of that stuff, you don't need to worry about. It's also accessible if you're not just good at RPGs or action RPGs. The easy mode and the classic mode really help out. So if you're just there for story, it's there. If you want combat stuff, normal is like a mid-space. You unlock hard mode later on, which is unfortunate if you're looking for that hard shot in one thing. The game has something to offer to old fans and new fans. So it's there as a complete package, and it'll probably spark your interest in the Final Fantasy VII universe if you're not already a fan. Because most people are probably going to go play the full Final Fantasy VII after they do this. So it's only better for you.
Absolutely. Well, that's another episode in the Tuck. I'm Jabrell, and I'm with
Steve.
And that's the NeoVintage Spoilercast. See you guys.
Take care.